Grains aren't supposed to stack straight up. They always collapse into a slope limited by something called the angle of repose. But what if that rule could be broken? In this video, we're going to talk about the angle of repose and how shifting this parameter can create an almost magical property like vertical stacking and even self-sorting. Now before we continue, I want to thank Dreamy for sponsoring this video. This is the Dreamy FP10 and it's basically like a robot vacuum for the air. Normally, if you have pets, you see fur floating through the beam of sunlight and dust just drifting around the room, and it ends up everywhere. But the cool thing about this purifier is that it uses what Dreamy calls loop boost airflow, which means it actively pulls floating hair and particles toward the machine instead of just passively waiting for them to wander in. So it's not just cleaning the air right around the purifier, it's actually helping grab the stuff that's still moving around the room. Most air purifiers just trap all that junk in the filter, so over time the filter gets clogged. But the Dreamy FP10 has an active fur collection and self-cleaning system that gathers the hair into a separate visible chamber. So instead of everything just matting into the main filter, a lot of that pet hair gets collected where you can actually see it, empty it, and rinse it out. That means less maintenance and your main filter stays cleaner for longer. It also has a 4-stage filtration system with an H14 HEPA filter, so it's not just for fur. It's also capturing really tiny particles, allergens, dust, and helping with odors too. I did a quick test with my air quality monitor and some fog spray, and immediately the air quality dropped to 0. But very quickly after I turned on my Dreamy filter, all of the particulates were filtered out of the air. So if you've got pet smells or just that stale air that builds up indoors, this is built to help with that as well. So if you want to check out the Dreamy FP10, I'll put the link in the description and the pinned comment. So big thanks to Dreamy for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to our experiment. In 2013, the largest landslide in US history occurred when 100 million tons of rock came crashing down at Bingham Canyon Mine in Utah. Luckily, no one was injured because engineers knew it was going to happen. The reason they knew was because of a property of all grains, including soil, called the angle of repose. It's not hard to figure out the angle of repose for a certain grain. You just pour it into a pile and it naturally forms a maximum slope. That slope depends on properties like shape, friction coefficient, and cohesion between particles. Chia seeds have a very low angle of repose, around 16 degrees. The highest angle of repose of normal materials is around 45 degrees, like this flower here. Once that angle has naturally formed, if you cause it to be steeper, then it'll cause an avalanche that adjusts to the right angle again. That's why avalanches occur on snow-covered mountains and why engineers carefully design slopes in mines, road cuts, and construction sites to remain below this critical angle. What's weird is that when you mix two grains with different angles of repose, they don't form an average slope though. Instead, they do something unexpected. For example, in this box I have one type of sand with a low angle of repose and one with a higher angle. So let's shake them and try to mix it together. But now watch what happens when we pour the sand. You can see that it forms these striations or stripes. These stripes happen because each type of grain flows differently as a pile forms. The grains with the lower angle of repose move more easily, so when an avalanche happens, they travel farther. The grains with the higher angle of repose are more resistant to motion, so they stop sooner and pile up higher. So instead of mixing evenly, each tiny avalanche acts like a sorting process, separating the grains based on how easily they move. You can kind of see this process happen where instead of piling up, we watch it slide down. You can see that they kind of take turns here. The white and then the blue, and then the white and then the blue. Over time, this repeated process builds visible layers. So just by having different angles of repose, the system naturally organizes into order. This is why if you've ever tried to mix two different powders or grains together, they sometimes refuse to mix. For example, I have some powder here that I tried mixing sugar into. Watch what happens when I pour it. It forms these stripes. Even when I put it in a bag and move it around, these layers always form. It's so weird that differences in angle of repose keep the materials separated when it seems like they should just mix together. That's how these desktop sand toys work. Even in water, the different angles of repose create striations, and the sands never fully mix. They're really cool to have around. You turn it upside down and it forms a new structure every time with these natural looking geological layers. One property that greatly affects the angle of repose is cohesion between particles. For example, if I take some dry sand and pour it into a pile, it forms an angle of repose of around 40 degrees. If I pour that same sand underwater, it forms a slope that's slightly lower, but still very similar. But something strange happens right at the interface between water and air. The cohesion between the particles increases dramatically, and the sand begins to exhibit an extremely high natural angle of repose. Now, we already know that wet sand can stick together. That's how sandcastles are made. But building a sandcastle requires additional compaction and energy input. So I wanted to see if it's possible to maximize the angle of repose without any compaction, and whether we can achieve a true 90-degree angle of repose. To achieve this, I have a reservoir of water and a porous sponge that the sand falls onto. So I just have a tube here that's open on both ends, and then some little packing material that's porous, and then sand on top. So now the water level is about to the point of where the porous material ends, so the sand is already stacked up a few centimeters above that point. So you have this porous media that can suck up the water around it while keeping the sand stable and letting the other sand that doesn't stick flow over the edge. Now, when you pour the sand on, the water can wick up and the other sand around it doesn't build up, and it starts stacking higher and higher. Look how cool this is. This sand just keeps building up until it reaches the funnel it's pouring from. This is so weird. It's a 90-degree angle of repose. This happens because just at the right moisture level, tiny liquid bridges form between the grains as they make contact. These capillary forces cause each grain to stick instantly upon landing. As water is drawn upward through the sand by capillary action, newly deposited grains become wet. This allows the structure to grow one particle at a time. Instead of sliding down into a slope, the grains lock into place, building a self-assembled tower. And when everything's perfectly balanced, like gravity, cohesion, and fluid transport, the angle of repose doesn't just increase, but it becomes perfectly vertical. So I'm gonna slow down the flow rate a little bit to see how high I can actually get. So the highest I was able to get was about 10 centimeters, and the base is only about 0.5 centimeters wide. That means it's a slenderness ratio of about 20:1. That's like stacking a column as tall as a 2-story house on something the width of a dinner plate. That's closer to what you'd expect from a solid beam, not a pile of grains. So whether it's preventing landslides or understanding why materials won't mix, or even stacking sand straight up, it all comes down to the angle of repose. And thanks for watching another episode of the Action Lab. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, remember to hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you next time.